I preached against witchcraft for years while secretly refusing to save my dying mother because of a covenant I had made. For years, I stood behind the pulpit and preached against witchcraft. I warned families never to consult dark powers. I told my congregation that anyone who traded another person's life for success would eventually answer before God. But every time I preached those messages, there was one face I could never erase from my mind. My mother, the woman who gave birth to me, was dying. I had more than enough money to pay for her treatment, but I refused, not because I hated her. I refused because years earlier, I had made a covenant that forbade me from saving the woman who gave me life. I thought I could carry that secret to my grave, but today, I am confessing why I abandoned my own mother and the price I paid for choosing power over the woman who raised me. The last time my younger brother called me, I already knew what he was going to say. Before I answered the phone, I just sat there looking at it. It rang once, then it rang again. When I finally picked up, his voice was shaking. "Brother, Mama isn't responding anymore. The doctors say if you don't move her to a specialist hospital immediately, you may lose her." I closed my eyes, not because I was surprised, but because I had been expecting that call for weeks. My brother continued to say that we've sold everything we can sell. We've borrowed from everyone willing to help. You are the only one who can save her now. Those words cut through me because he was right. By then, I had built churches. I owned properties. The amount they needed to save my mother was less than what my church spent decorating the altar for one conference. I could have paid it immediately without borrowing, without thinking twice. But instead, I said something that still haunts me today. I told him I can't help. There was silence on the other end. Then my brother asked me the question I had feared for years. Why? I wanted to tell him. I wanted to confess everything. I wanted to explain that my refusal had nothing to do with money, nothing to do with hatred, nothing to do with family disagreements. But I couldn't, because the real reason sounded too evil to believe. So instead, I lied. I told him I didn't have the money. He began crying. "Brother, please. She's our mother. She carried us. She suffered for us. Don't let her die like this." Every word felt like a knife because I knew something he didn't. Years before I ever stood behind a pulpit, before people called me man of God, before miracles, before television, before thousands followed my ministry, I entered into an agreement. One that came with a condition so terrible that from the day I accepted it, I knew this phone call would eventually come. And I also knew when it came, I would have to choose between the woman who gave me life and the promise that had built my ministry. And I chose my ministry. For years, I convinced myself it was too late to change anything. Today, I know I was wrong, because no success is worth the price I paid. The truth is that I wasn't always a successful pastor. There was a time when I preached to empty benches. Some Sundays, there were more chairs than people. There were days I questioned whether God had really called me into ministry. Then, after one evening service, a man waited for me outside the church. He wasn't one of my members. I had never seen him before. He greeted me respectfully. I thought he wanted to encourage me. Over the next period of our talks and chats, he made me to understand that there are people who can help my ministry become everything I have been praying for. This made me uncomfortable, and for the following weeks, I couldn't stop thinking about what he had said. Part of me wanted to ignore him, but the other part, the deepest part, wanted to know what he meant. So, I eventually agreed to follow him to where he was talking about without knowing what to expect. The day we went, we drove for hours until we reached a very large dense forest. There was this nice building in the forest far from the main road. From the outside, it looked like an ordinary retreat center. Nothing about it suggested what would happen inside. When we entered, I noticed something immediately. There were men dressed in expensive suits, business owners, community leaders, people whose faces I recognized from newspapers and television, and among them were pastors. Some led churches much larger than mine, and I couldn't understand why they were there. The man who took me looked at me and smiled. You are not the first preacher to ask that question. Later, he led me into a private room where an elderly man was waiting. He didn't ask me about my education. He didn't ask about my denomination. He asked only one question. Why do you want your ministry to grow? I answered without thinking. I want more people to know God. He looked at me for a long moment, then he smiled. No, tell me what you really want. I remained silent. He continued, do you want influence? Do you want crowds? Do you want people to travel across the country just to hear you preach? Do you want doors to open wherever you go? Every question exposed something I had been hiding even from myself. Finally, I lowered my head and said yes. He nodded slowly and said, now we are beginning to tell each other the truth. For the next hour, he spoke about influence, recognition, and power. He made it sound as though success always demanded a prize. Then he looked directly at me and said something I have never forgotten. Every covenant has conditions. The question isn't whether you are willing to receive. The question is what you are willing to surrender. At first, the conditions sounded simple. Absolute secrecy, complete loyalty, never reveal how your influence began, and never break the agreement. Then, he mentioned one final condition. He spoke it so calmly that at first I didn't understand what he meant. He said, if the day ever comes, when the woman who gave you life stands between you and this covenant, you must never choose her. I frowned and I asked him, what does that mean? He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he slid a small notebook across the table. Inside were several written conditions. The last one had already been marked. It simply read, when the appointed day comes, you must not use what you have gained to preserve the life that first preserved yours. I stared at the sentences for several minutes. It sounded impossible. I even laughed. That day would never come, I told myself. My mother was healthy, strong. There was no reason to believe I would ever face such a choice. Looking back today, that was the lie I told myself to quiet my conscience. The elderly man looked at me one last time and said, if you cannot accept every condition, walk away now. And I wish I had. Instead, I convinced myself that some consequences were too far into the future to matter. That night, I made a decision that transformed my ministry, but it also planted the seed for the greatest regret of my life. Years later, when my brother called to tell me my mother was dying, I realized that the condition I had ignored was no longer just words on a page. It was demanding to be fulfilled. You see, for years, nothing happened. My ministry grew beyond anything I had imagined. The small church I once struggled to keep open became one of the fastest growing ministries in our region. Every revival attracted thousands of people. People traveled long distance just to attend our services. Television stations invited me for interviews. Doors I never thought would opened effortlessly. Then one afternoon, my younger brother called. He told me our mother had collapsed without warning. At first, I wasn't worried. I transferred money for her initial treatment and continued with my ministry. A few days later, he called again. This time, his voice sounded different. The doctor says her condition is getting worse. They want to transfer her to another hospital, and we don't have enough money. He told me exactly how much they needed. It wasn't beyond my reach. In fact, I had spent more than that amount furnishing my office just a few months earlier. Before I could say anything, the sentence I had read years earlier returned to my mind with frightening clarity. You must not use what you have gained to preserve the life that first preserved yours. For the first time in years, I remembered every word of that agreement. I told him I will call him back. That night, I didn't sleep. I kept asking myself one question. What if none of it is true? What if I'm allowing fear to destroy my own family? The next few days, my brother called again. This time, he wasn't asking for money. He was begging, "Please come and see her. She keeps asking for you." I promised him I would, and I never went. Instead, I buried myself in church programs, counseling sessions, and revival meetings. It was easier to preach to strangers than to look my own mother in the eyes. Every time my phone rang, I feared it was another call from home. Every time I stood behind the pulpit and spoke about faith, I heard another voice inside me asking, what kind of pastor abandons his own mother? Weeks passed. Then the call I had been dreading finally came. My brother didn't cry. He didn't shout. He simply said, "She's gone." I couldn't speak. The room around me suddenly felt empty. I sat there holding the phone long after the call had ended. For the first time since that decision years earlier, I realized what I had truly sacrificed. It wasn't just my mother's life. It was my own peace. Her funeral was one of the hardest days of my life. People expected me to comfort everyone else. Instead, I stood beside her coffin knowing that whether the covenant was real or whether I had been manipulated into believing it, the decision had been mine. No one forced me to refuse her. No one stopped me from getting into my car. No one prevented me from sending the money. I had chosen fear over love, and that is a choice I can never undo. That was the day I finally understood something I wish I had learned years earlier. The greatest reason is not always the one someone else builds around you. Sometimes, it is the one you build inside your own conscience. Understand this if you are part of the people who often ask, "Pastor, why didn't you simply walk away?" The truth is, I wasn't looking for darkness. I was looking for results. When I started my ministry, I genuinely believed God had called me. I prayed, I fasted, I preached wherever anyone invited me. Sometimes I traveled for hours just to speak to 10 people. There were Sundays when the entire offering couldn't even cover our transport home. Month after month, I watched other ministries grow while mine remained the same. Slowly, discouragement became frustration. Then frustration became desperation. I stopped asking God, "Lord, what are you teaching me?" And I started asking, "Lord, why is everyone else moving ahead except me?" That change in my heart was the beginning of my downfall. When the man approached me with promises of influence and rapid growth, he didn't create greed inside me. He simply found the greed that was already there. He didn't force me to make that decision. I made it myself. Looking back now, I realized the greatest danger wasn't the promise that was made to me. It was my willingness to believe there was a shortcut to what I wanted. If I had been content to grow slowly, if I had trusted God's timing, I would never have accepted that invitation. Everything that happened afterward began with one simple decision. I became impatient, and impatient cost me more than I was ever willing to pay. Now, people still ask me whether my ministry was worth the price I paid. My answer is always the same: no. And if I could go back to that night, I would gladly preach to empty chairs for the rest of my life. I would rather be an unknown pastor with a clear conscience than a famous preacher haunted by the memory of the woman who sacrificed everything to raise me. The painful truth is this: success can hide guilt from the public, but it can never hide it from your own heart. For years, people celebrated my growth. They admired my ministry. They believed God had blessed me beyond measure. But every time someone called me a man of God, I remembered the phone call from my younger brother. Every time I stood behind the pulpit, I remembered my mother's voice asking why I never came. Those memories became a prison I carried everywhere. That is why I have decided to tell this story. Not because I expect people to feel sorry for me, but because I don't want another young pastor, another desperate believer, to convince themselves that there is a shortcut to God's purpose. If an opportunity demands your conscience, your integrity, or the people you love, the price is already too high. My mother deserved a son who chose her over ambition. Instead, she became the reminder of the greatest mistake of my life. That is the confession I will carry for the rest of my days. And if my story causes even one person to walk away from a path that promises everything but quietly demands too much, then perhaps my failure will not have been completely wasted. May God have mercy on me and everyone else.